I think the clock has ticked across to 4 o'clock, so it's time for us to commence. So, hi everybody. If you are here to watch Curtin Corner, you are in the right spot. And if you're not, just stay anyway. It's lovely to have you here. It's John Phillamoy here. I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy, the JCIPP, and it's lovely to have you here to watch our first Curtin Corner of the year. And if you've never been before, it's great to have you with us. And for many of you, I've just looked at some of the people who are attending. You're welcome back to Curtin Corner because many of you are regulars. Of course, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the lands from which we are hosting today's webinar. And wherever you're watching from, on your behalf, I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. The John Curtin Institute of Public Policy, JCIPP, has been running Curtin Corners on Friday afternoons for 20 years, I think, this year. Maybe even longer, but certainly 20 years. And we've had speakers from inside and outside the university on a range of topics connected to politics, public policy, broadly defined. And of course, today is no exception. We do record the sessions and we then put them up on our website for everybody to watch. I think we're recording right now, hopefully. Yes, we are. And so please take the time to look at our past talks and encourage your colleagues to do the same. It can take a little while for the talks to appear, maybe a week or so. So it will be up hopefully next week. I did send a note around last week about the fact that all our 2025 and previous years presentations are up on our website. The 2025 ones, depending on which link you click, some of them are going nowhere, but some of the links actually do work. We're fixing that up by next week. That should all be fine. But you can certainly look at 20 or 30 or 40 talks over the last couple of years up on the website. It's a great way to just reacquaint yourself with some of the issues that we've been discussing over the period. We like to encourage debate. So later on, after Helen finishes her prepared comments, we get you to ask some questions using Slido, S-L-I-D-O. It's very easy to use. You just either download it from the App Store, which you can still do, or you just go www.slido.com and you can do it from there. And once you're in, you enter the event code, and the event code is JCIPP. It's very easy, and then that'll get you into the questions, and you can just submit a question of your own, or you can like somebody else's question, and then I will facilitate the discussion based on those questions. And I always find it's easiest to just use my mobile phone for the Slido, watch the presentation on my computer or my iPad. So now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Helen Creed. Helen's a social worker by background, but she has held very senior positions in the trade union movement in Western Australia, nationally and internationally, and she's also held many senior positions in the WA public service and the community sector. For example, she was Executive Director of Children and Family Services in the Department of Communities, and she was Executive Director of the Community Legal Centres Association of WA. And she's also served on many boards and committees, and most recently she just concluded a 5-year stint on the board of the Water Corporation, where she was Deputy Chair. But most significantly, of course, for today's purposes, Helen was the original co-convener with Joan Kerner of Emily's List Australia, and she'll tell you all about Emily's List. It's an organisation established to support the election of progressive Labor women candidates into Parliament. And she was inducted into the West Australian Women's Hall of Fame in 2018. And earlier this week, there was an induction of another group of women into the Hall of Fame. So Helen, it's fantastic you're our first cab off the rank this year, not only a few days after International Women's Day, and you've agreed to give our first Curtin Corner. We're really looking forward to what you've got to say, and then we'll have a great chat afterwards. So for now, over to you.
Thanks, John. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also I think it's appropriate, given Noongar country is a matriarchal society, to specifically acknowledge the strength and resilience of Aboriginal women. I also want to say thank you to John for hosting this Curtin Corner as a serious event to celebrate International Women's Day, because in recent years many of us have been frustrated with the corporatisation of International Women's Day with celebratory morning teas, rather than focusing on the history of International Women's Day, which is a history of women's struggles to achieve social, economic, cultural and political equality. And my presentation today focuses on the area of political equality. So while Australia was recognised as a global leader in terms of women's suffrage, the election of women to Australian parliaments has been a very different story with fairly limited representation. However, today, women comprise over 50% of the Australian Labor Party parliamentary caucuses at both the federal and at the WA state level. This hasn't happened by chance. It's the result of concerted and sustained advocacy by women since the 1980s. And in this Curtin Corner, I'm reflecting on my experiences from across the Labor movement about how this milestone was achieved and what lessons might have for other political parties and organisations. I want to start with an extract from a paper that Robin Joyce presented to a Women and Labour conference held in Perth in 1983. And she tells us that the first women's conference was held in Trades Hall in 1912. It started on the 23rd of October and went for 7 days. One of the motions recorded under the title Equality of the Sexes was that this Conference of Labor Women affirms the desirability of admission of women to Parliament and considers that when elected, they shall be regarded as being eligible to accept and fill any position therein open to members of the opposite sex. 1912. Judith Watson, in her publication, We Hold Up Half the Sky, provided some insights into the life and the struggles of the earliest women politicians and how WA has provided a number of firsts for women in this country. Her publication includes speeches from May Holman, the first Labor woman elected to an Australian Parliament in 1925, Senator Dorothy Tagney, the first woman to be elected to the Senate in 1943, and Ruby Hutchinson, the first woman to be elected to any Legislative Council in 1954. It also includes a speech from Pat Giles, Senator Pat Giles, and Lecky Hopkins and Lynn Rorty in their life story of Pat called Among the Chosen, comment that the speech that Pat chose for included in Judith's collection was her speech during the Sex Discrimination Bill in 1983. And her reason for doing that was, we need reminding of how much this legislation was needed, what opposition we had to overcome, and how few nations have human rights machinery with which to protect the rights of their people. Labor women politicians such as Pat Giles were also active within the party itself on the issue of affirmative action. And so I'd like to start with 1981, where Susan Ryan presented the results of her groundbreaking gender gap research to the National Labor Women's Conference. Her recommendations included that legislation should be developed stating a minimum quota participation for both genders in Parliament, and ratios between gender be introduced for parliamentary executive positions. In Western Australia, Yvonne Henderson introduced her report on affirmative action to the WA ALP State Executive in July 1984 with the following comment. Following the heavy electoral defeat of the Labor Party in 1975 and 1977, the party embarked on a period of intense introspection. We put the spotlight on our own structures and policies and sought the reason for our rejection by the electorate. Among the various discussion papers to emerge was one on women. It found that the Labor Party was seen as a predominantly male organisation and that its structures were not conducive to involvement by women. During the 1980s, a number of affirmative action, often called AA rules, were adopted in the national and state branches of the Australian Labor Party. WA was the first state branch to adopt an AA rule applying to multiple elected positions, and these were for the structures within the ALP, the branches, the electorate councils, the delegates to state conference and to state executive. And it ensured that at least 1/3 of those positions would go to women. Within the administration committee, sort of the executive, if you like, or the executive of the executive, at least 2 of the 6 committee positions, 1 of the 3 trustees and 1 of the vice president positions were guaranteed to women. These rule changes also provided that the implementation of affirmative action had to be monitored. At the 1988 ALP State Conference, for example, the branch resolved that all decision-making structures survey their membership annually with a view to ensuring the party's affirmative action requirements are met. This should be done in August each year, so that time is available before annual elections to encourage women to nominate for office. Similar affirmative action rules were introduced into the peak councils of the trade union movement during the 1980s. And affirmative action was a way of systematically dismantling barriers which directly or indirectly discriminated against women. It's not an end in itself. And I want to use an example from my own experience to illustrate this. I was elected as both a vice president of Trades and Labour Council WA, which is what Unions WA used to be called, and the executive of the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Firstly, in affirmative action positions. However, when I was elected secretary of the MISOs in 1990, I stepped down from that AA vice president position at the TLC on the basis that affirmative action was about giving women the opportunities they wouldn't normally have. My view was that now I was secretary of one of the state's largest unions, I should be elected in my own right, and I was not going to stand as the affirmative action vice president. I didn't, and it wasn't until the following year that I was elected in my own right as a vice president. Labor women recognised that affirmative action in internal ballots, while it was important progress, it wasn't translating into greater parliamentary representation of women. And discussions began across the country among women in the ALP in the early 90s to campaign for the existing AA rules to be extended to parliamentary seats. And so the focus was on the 1994 National Conference. And the lobby, which was really led by this very powerful at the time Status of Women Committee in the Victorian branch, we organised a series of women's conferences around Australia, beginning in Queensland, and that coined the phrase half by 2000. And the recommendation from the final National Labor Women's Conference held in Adelaide in 1994 to the full conference that year was about the pre-selection rule changes. 1994, of course, was the centenary of women's suffrage, white women's suffrage. And we were really faced and confronted by the fact that having the right to stand for Parliament had not by itself resulted in significant numbers of women winning seats. And it was September 1994, and I was privileged to be a delegate to the National ALP Conference, which agreed to a rule change requiring that by 2002, a minimum of 35% of Labor candidates in winnable seats must be women. And there's all sorts of comments about it being a quota. And so I just want to unpack that a little, because the key components of that rule change was, it was a rule change, and rules are really important in both the Labor Party and the trade union movement. We do live by the rules. It set a target. It wasn't referred to as a quota, it was a target. It established a timeline by which that target should be reached. So it wasn't this will happen tomorrow. And it included a sanction. And I think the sanction, which was if the target was not reached, then all pre-selections were to be reopened until the target was reached. And I think the sanction was perhaps the most powerful element of that rule change, because if all pre-selections were to be reopened, it potentially not only exposed all the factional wheeling and dealing and the cosy deals that had been put in place, but it also had the potential of undoing them. And so that approach with the same 4 elements was reflected in rules adopted by various state and territory branches. It was a target for winnable seats. And so in some branches, there was the upper house and lower house was combined to get the 35%. In others, it was applied separately to each house. The WA rules were actually amended at its state conference a couple of months before then and provided for 30% women candidates in winnable seats at the 1997 election and increasing to 35% in 2001. The headlines in the West at the time read, as you can see, ALP men won't shift for women. It included comments from various male politicians who'd allegedly been targeted to step aside or retire. The following day, an article appeared called Wealth of Women, which quoted a number of prominent women referring to the wealth of talented women who were ready to step in and increase the number of women MPs at the next election. And some of the quotes were from Kay Hallahan, who was then the deputy opposition leader. There is going to be no shortage of women coming forward to contest these positions. From Judith Watson, who was then the opposition spokesperson for women's interests, the percentage of women in Parliament was unjust and she would have preferred a 40% quota. And from myself, who said men did not need to worry about affirmative action, what they should be worried about is competence. These developments in the ALP were not occurring in isolation. Within the industrial wing of the labour movement, the success of the affirmative action strategies were even more apparent. Excuse me. When Jenny George was elected onto the ACTU executive in 1983, she was the first woman to hold such a position. Within less than 10 years, affirmative action rules were introduced into the ACTU, providing for 50% representation on the executive. And the headline on the story, which ran in The Age that day, which said ACTU executive now comprises 50% women, was significant. But what I'd particularly like to share with you is one of the quotes. The ACTU will make World Union history tomorrow with a new executive of 50% women. It will also be the first time a major national organisation has adopted affirmative action policies at its highest governing level. Jenny, in a paper she presented to the Women, Power and 21st Century conference in December 1993, talked about the 4 steps that were taken to change such a predominantly male institution as the trade union movement. And I want to share those with you. The first part of it was there was a need to align the cause and the case of women with the overall objectives and vision of the organisation. For the union movement at the time, this was about recruitment. And in fact, one of the newspaper headlines at the time of the 1989 ACTU Congress, when these rules were introduced, read, ACTU sends SOS to women. Fixing a problem, and that's what it was seen as, was not seen to be the responsibility of women. It was seen to be the entire organisation. Secondly, the change was supported and led by senior people with credibility. At the ACTU Congress, it was the ACTU, a very influential person, Bill Kelty, who said in the debate, "It's simply not good enough for us year after year, Congress after Congress, resolution after resolution to talk about it. It's time we started to do something, started to do it. That is, we have to ensure that women are seen and involved in unions as equal partners. Anything less is a failure." Similarly, Paul Keating, who was Prime Minister at the time of the ALP's rule changes, said in his speech to the National Conference, "There is a great deal yet to be done. We must get more women into the parliaments of Australia, and we are now committed to doing that. When half the population is more strongly represented, we will all be stronger for it." Looking back, that was a really important statement from the then Prime Minister, as still today, too often, gender equality is framed as a battle of women versus men, as though gains for one must mean losses for the other. Whereas the evidence that is that in places where women do well, men tend to do well too. The third part of the campaign was that we had a strategy to achieve the goals. Being angry, being stroppy, disaffected is understandable and sometimes useful, but frustration of itself does not produce results. A calculated strategy was needed. For the ACT, it was a gradual process. It was the creation of specific positions. And again, targets were set to so that the rules were formally amended at each Congress from 25 to 30 to 40 and finally to 50% women on the executive. Initially, this was achieved by simply adding women to the executive to meet the target. But over time, it was amended to ensure that unions only received a second delegate when that to the executive in ascending order of size in order to meet the target. So those larger unions were encouraged, shall we say, to ensure that women were there as their delegates. The fourth issue was that the women had credibility. The women leading this at the ACTU were already senior women who were elected into senior positions in their own unions. And similarly with the ALP, it was people like former premiers Joan Kirner and Carmen Lawrence, as well as ministers such as Kay Setches, who was president of the Victorian Status of Women Policy Committee, the elected women MPs who were playing a very significant role. And by that stage, both territories had been led by women. Labor women. Rosemary Follett had been elected by the ACT Assembly as the inaugural Chief Minister, and she led Labor to victory at the 1992 election. And Claire Martin, who was opposition leader, won the territory election in 2001. Not only was the first woman Chief Minister, but also the first time the Labor Party had won in a Northern Territory election. So we talk about there being two wings of the labour movement, the political wing and the industrial wing, and the impact of these changes occurring across both the parts of the movement and involving many of the same players should not be underestimated, because there was union leaders such as Jenny George, Sharon Burrow, Wendy Caird and myself who were active in the ALP at that time as well. I want to now go back to the pre-selection rules in the ALP because it became clear pretty quickly that while we had the rules, that was not enough. In the 1995 federal pre-selections, the number of women pre-selected into safe and winnable seats actually declined. The pre-selection battles for the 1997 federal election saw Labor women add don't stickers. We had these T-shirts, women count in the ALP, and we added don't to those. and a proposal to threaten to stand a prominent woman against then Labor leader Kim Beazley as a protest about the failure to promote women was put in place. The ALP pre-selection for Cowan was also generated a response from the Hon. Judy Moylan, then the Minister for the Status of Women, who issued a media release headed "Labor men pushed in while women shoved aside," and she contrasted the coalition's success in electing women without quotas. So we were faced with a very stark reality that the 1994 affirmative action rules in the ALP were not enough. If we wanted to achieve gender equality in our party, in our parliaments, then we also had to shift the culture as well as change the rules. And a key part of doing so was to establish Emily's List, which happened in 1996. Emily's List is a financial and political support network for progressive Labor women candidates. Emily is an acronym. Early money is like yeast because it makes the dough rise. You put money in early, and that had significant benefits. It was based on Emily's List in the United States, which in the US is specifically about pro-choice Democrat women, and it supports them for election with funding, campaign advice, skills, and information. And one of the Victorian Labor women, Leonie Morgan, presented a workshop about Emily's List to the conference, the Labor Women's Conference in 1994. Some people initially were a bit lukewarm, but eventually we saw that it needed an organisation such as Emily's List to change the culture within the ALP. We were initially going to set it up within the Labor Party structures, but it became fairly obvious fairly quickly to many of us that some of the key men in the ALP were not going to allow women to run the show. So not without some controversy at the time, we set it up outside the ALP. While only supporting ALP women candidates, membership of the ALP is not a requirement for membership. And Emily's List actively recruited women who were not party members but keen to support progressive women candidates as members. As I've said, Emily's List was launched at the end of 1996, and I had the privilege of being one of the original co-conveners with Joan Kerner. And that was the formal governance for the operations of Emily's List, and it consisted of 2 members from each of the 8 state and territories. We had a genuine commitment to making Emily's List a national organisation. And Cheryl Davenport, who took over from me as co-convener in 2000, recalls that we also felt it was important at the time to have a woman who was not a politician or a former politician, and a person who was younger, as well as being from the other side of the country in the role of co-convener with Joan. From the first election Emily's List was involved in, when the six Emily's List women we supported in the South Australian state election all won in 1997, through to the most recent elections, Emily's List has supported more than 300 progressive women, progressive Labor women into Australian parliaments. It's not surprising that many of the key feminists who were integral to the adoption of the AA rule changes in the ALP and the union movement were also founding members of Emily's List, and that Emily's List continued to play a role in the affirmative action debate. As the original end date for the 1994 rule changes, 2002, approached, it may have appeared that critical mass had been achieved to guard against any backsliding. But we weren't taking any chances, so Emily's List launched the Lift the Target campaign, which resulted in a rule change providing for a minimum of 40% from each gender, and eventually in changes that occurred to the ALP rules in 2015, where 50% female representation by 2025 was to be achieved. With the Lift the Target, of course, there was a campaign T-shirt, and key negotiators, you might recognise younger looking Penny Wong and Sharon Jackson in that photo. The third photo is of the marching girls, and I included that because as feminists we're often told that we don't have much of a sense of humour. But our marching girls toiled their way through the conference floor, garnering support for the rule change. This target has not only been achieved in WA and federally, but a number of the other states and territories as well. The number of women in Parliament have increased, the number of women ministers and women leaders has increased. And there are still issues such as the need for gender balance in cabinet positions. And we're also now focused increasing our representation of other groups, including First Nations people and those from a cold background. Emily's List was very proudly supported Carol Martin, the first Indigenous woman to be elected to an Australian Parliament as the MLA for the Kimberley. Her comment that she was a role model for young people. We have cleared a path for you, applied more broadly, as Emily's List promoted the concept of a future woman Prime Minister. That photo was taken in 2001. From the outset, Emily's List stayed out of pre-selections, it still does. But once women have been pre-selected, while many of them are already Emily's List members, those who aren't are approached if they want to be part of Emily's List. And the significant issue is a commitment to choice, to pro-choice. When we first established Emily's List, we said there were 4 pillars: choice, childcare, equal pay, and equity and diversity. Our terminology has changed in that we now talk about affordable, accessible early childhood education and care, for example, but the key principles are the same. And while we do have many more women in parliaments across Australia, they're not just bums on seats, but committed to improving the lives of women through an array of policy initiatives. Helen Clark, who was New Zealand's Prime Minister from 1999 to 2008, said, "What I like about the Emily's List approach is that it unashamedly promotes women who will advocate for equity and justice and are pro-choice and pro-childcare." And as Jenny Macklin observed in a speech to a Labor Women's Conference during the Howard government, what's the value of large numbers of women backbenchers and frontbenchers with significant portfolios if they attack the policies on which women have come to rely? By contrast, the election of Labor women have seen what we once regarded or were once regarded as women's policies become mainstream. Maternity leave is now parental leave, the rights for casual and part-time workers, flexible working hours, which were initially advocated as a way of assisting women with their family responsibilities. I want to turn to Michelle Grattan's article recently, January, where it was the article that was headlined "Two Aspirants Who Are Unlikely to Suit the Times Vie for Liberal Leadership," which reported on that meeting between the then leadership aspirants and other factional heavyweights, all male, on the day of the memorial service for their colleague Katie Allen. And she says in that article, "Albanese knows how reliant he is on the female vote and does everything he can to ensure it's cemented in. It's not just reminding people more than half his caucus are women. It's serious policy pitched at women, most notably childcare, but also improvements in parental leave, superannuation and other measures. It's leaning often to preferring women for top appointments. It's support for low-paid workers in feminised industries. The Liberals, whoever leads them, can't or won't compete on such fronts and are even conflicted about work from home." So what other lessons can be learned from this campaign to increase the number of women in Parliament? As Michelle Grattan said in the same article, the Liberals can't regain office without polling much better with female voters. Tackling their gender problem goes well beyond the familiar debate about whether the Liberals should adopt quotas for women candidates. though they might help. But in terms of that focus on quotas, I trust my presentation has made it very clear that the ALP, as I said, had 4 interrelated aspects: a rule change, a target, timelines, and a sanction. To my knowledge, that sanction, the reopening of all pre-selections, was never needed to be implemented. It was such a powerful incentive to do the right thing. But I also want to emphasise that the target referred to winnable seats. Kay Setchers described the devastation for women in Victoria prior to the AA pre-selection rules being introduced. She said, "I was a Victorian Labor MP from 1982 to 92 and served in the Kane and Kerner governments. These governments had record numbers of women elected in 1982 and 1985, and we thought this was the beginning of a natural increase in the number of ALP women in Parliament. However, most of these Victorian women MPs were in marginal seats, and nearly 50% lost their seats in the 1992 election." Jane Hume made a comment about the most recent election. You don't need to look too far to see that in the last election, we had an extraordinary number of really good quality female candidates with us stepping up for us in important seats that we really needed to win. Unfortunately, though, when the electoral tide works against you and those women don't get up, so on. So the point that I want to emphasise is that the rule changes were about winnable seats, not marginal seats, which is where so many women originally were pre-selected to contest. If you look at the current electoral pendulum in Western Australia, there are 11 ALP-held seats with a margin under 6% in the state parliament. Of those, 6 of the 11 are held by men. So that issue of women in winnable seats is very important. The other key aspect for that was we had that mechanism for bringing about cultural change in order to successfully implement a rule change. And I have shared with you that I believe that mechanism was Emily's List. But this debate is more than that. I think we can also look at what we see as our definition of merit. And Dale Spender was pretty blunt. Men can't or won't see that their definitions of merit, expectations, and experience are nothing more than rules they have made up to protect their own positions. Or, as noted in Inside Cover back in 1999, merit is an acronym: men or mates, elevated regardless of intellect or talent. One of the other aspects that we've learnt is the importance of networking and support. One of the key slogans of Emily's List is when women support women, women win. We're about women helping other women change the face of politics. Jane Hume, again, and I'm quoting her as the deputy leader, in an article that Marnie True wrote for the ABC, had made the comment, we have to work for what we want. And for women that don't get there, well, the trick is work that little bit harder. Don't get bitter, get better. So that contrast between the collective approach with the individual woman's responsibility approach. I also wanted to make the observation that in preparing this presentation, I was struck by how little discussion there is today about the glass ceiling, maybe because so many of the firsts have been achieved. But going back 20 years, Michelle Ryan and Alexander Haslam from the University of Exeter in the UK wrote about this in relation to the corporate world in the following terms. Evidence suggests that while women are typically confronted by an invisible barrier preventing their rise into leadership ranks, the glass ceiling, men, particularly those in female-dominated professions, are more likely to be conveyed into management positions by means of a glass elevator. They went on to look at this concept that while women were beginning to break through the glass ceiling, they were more likely to find themselves on a glass cliff, such that their position of leadership was risky or precarious. Further work applied this to politics, and they particularly looked at Margaret Thatcher's career, which they described as a series of glass cliff situations. And they also included a reference to Australia. At that time, in Australia, there had only ever been two women state premiers, Joan Kirner in Victoria and Carmen Lawrence in Western Australia. Both were appointed mid-term and after their party had been exposed to humiliating scandals. As a result, both faced the prospect of unwinnable elections, which they duly lost. Of course, since that time, we've had a number of women premiers, starting with Anna Bligh, who succeeded Peter Beattie as the ALP Premier of Queensland in September 2007, but then subsequently led the ALP to victory in her own right at the 2009 Queensland election and was the first of the state premiers to do so. This glass cliff analogy certainly applies to Susan Lee. Time will tell whether Ashton Hearn in South Australia, Jess Wilson in Victoria, and Kelly Sloan in New South Wales will meet a similar fate. And finally, that appreciation that this was a long and concerted campaign of advocacy about women's political rights. It didn't happen overnight, but at the same time, we had the belief that change was possible, and that was integral to these developments. When Sharon Burrow formally seconded the motion to elect Jenny George as ACTU president in 1994, she talked about it being a historical day and that it was hugely symbolic. Because if it's possible to shift the male culture of the trade union movement in this way, then it's possible to shift anything. Being part of that change and similar changes gave us the belief that we could be part of other changes too. I'm happy to respond to questions or comments, but I'm also conscious that there are women who are part of this Curtin Corner who were also involved in this movement for change, and that they may wish to share their own reflections on some of the events that I've outlined. Because not only do I stand on the shoulders of my sisters, such as Senator Pat Giles, but I want to acknowledge the genuine sisterhood that has supported me throughout my various roles in the broader Labor movement. That's enabled me to have the privilege of being part of reaching the milestone in women's political leadership that we are celebrating today. Thank you.
That's terrific, Helen. Thanks very much. Just go one more on your slides there to end the sharing, and then we can chit chat ourselves. And while you're doing that, just down the bottom there it says end sharing, I think.
Yes.
Okay. That's it. Perfect. We're here. Just reminding everybody, you can ask some questions on Slido. There's already a few up there, but if you want to do it, just download Slido from the App Store or go to www.slido.com, and the event code is JCIPP. And we've already got a few questions. So and it doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment as well or a recollection. Just go for it, and Helen and I will be very happy to oblige and have a discussion about things. Okay, so we've got a question from Delia Hendry. Hi, Delia, a regular Curtin Corner listener, a well-respected academic here at Curtin. And Delia says or asks, has the cultural shift towards women representation reached a point where it's self-sustaining, or is there an ongoing need for active advocacy? So maybe start off within the Labor movement first, and then secondly, other organisations, because it sounds like mission accomplished in the Labor movement, but is that the case?
I think, as I said before, there was a bit of a sense back in the day that when you reached a critical mass of about 30%, that was sufficient to see these changes embedded. But I guess our experience in Emily's List was that we were not 100% confident that that would be the case, which is why we continued to lobby around the affirmative action rules in terms of lift the target to the 40% and then more recently that 50-50. So I think there is certainly I can't see us going backwards in that sense, but there may well be ups and downs. And as I said, even with that those achievements, there are still some areas such as the number of women cabinet ministers where there's not that equality here in just WA. And we are still having some firsts. I mean, Michelle Roberts was the first woman speaker. I think, I'm sure someone will correct me, I think Alana was the first woman president in the upper house, Alana Pelosi. So there are still those changes to be made in the Labor movement. In terms of the broader community and there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of women on boards, women in senior executive positions, that broader debate. And Delia might like to say something more about that herself.
I mean, but actually comes into a second question, which Helen Verhoeven, again, another great Curtin Corner stalwart, mentions that Jane Hume, Jane, for those who don't know, Jane Hume is the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party and a former minister as well. And Helen mentions that Jane Hume's quote is such a male perspective. Is some of the language used by women in the LNP deterring strong women candidates who are ending up as teal candidates and therefore sort of still eating their lunch basically in those formerly safe Liberal seats? Is that part of the problem, you think, in the Liberal Party?
Yeah, I wouldn't profess to be an expert on the Liberal Party, but what I was trying to do was share the experience from the Labor movement and the approaches that we took. And still, we're talking 1983 to 2026, like it was a long time. And so I was more trying to reflect on that, and some of those quotes that I have are in contrast still, that approach to say it's about individual women needing to be better. And that quote from Yvonne Henderson in 1984, well, we were hearing similar things just recently after the 2025 election with the Liberal Party and the analysis that they have done. So I guess I was in a sense providing the information about the Labor movement because that's what I know and that's what I've been part of. Rather than, and people can make their own judgments in terms of the commentary and how it applies to the Liberal Party. Again, I'd use another example of the changes with the affirmative action rules. It was the people like Bill Callaghan were there at the conference moving the resolution. The Prime Minister was there talking about the importance of this. It's being left it seems to me, to women in the Liberal Party to be raising these issues. You've not got the Liberal, leadership coming out saying this is needed, this is required, this is essential, as it was by the Labor leaders back in the 90s.
And I mean, just reflecting, there's nothing inherent, it seems to me, about it being if you like, a progressive versus a conservative issue. If you look at other countries, I mean, New Zealand had a woman prime minister from the National Party, before Labor had a woman prime minister. In Britain, the Conservative Party had 3 women prime ministers. So there's nothing actually inherent, as far as I can tell, in individual liberal-minded parties being able to promote women in their ranks. Obviously, a collective action seems to make more of a difference potentially across the board, but there's certainly nothing inherent on the thought in the Conservative parties to be able to actually promote women more systematically.
That's right. And, you know, the recent commentary is about the Liberal Party established by Menzies was the party of women. And it was seen that the Labor Party, as those, that quote from Yvonne.
Sharon Burrow also mentioned about the blokey.
Yeah, that it was the Labor Party was seen to be dominated by men. Certainly the trade union movement was dominated by men. The fact that Jenny George, who at the time was the Australian Education Union delegate to the executive, was the first woman on the executive, and that was 1983, just demonstrates what a very blokey culture there was. But yeah, other people will have comments about that as well.
I mean, just going back to the question about the Labor Party and its culture, I had a question which was partly I put there just to get the ball rolling on the questions, but were there many public opponents within the Labor Party to the mid-1990s rule changes? I mean, obviously you had a couple of newspaper articles there, but I don't know whether they were people, you know, sort of sources said, or was it actually people, you know, on the record prepared to say this is a bad thing, or was the momentum so strong that there weren't people prepared to come out from within the Labor Party to in opposition? Because sometimes you get the momentum going, it can make it almost seem inevitable.
I think it was both in a sense, in that there were certainly a number of men in the Labor Party at the time who were opposed to it, but the momentum was building. And because of the key leadership, whether it was the Prime Minister, whether it was the ACT Secretary, who were saying it wasn't about individual pre-selections, as that quote from Kelty, it was about the survival of the union movement. It was about having women in leadership positions so women could see that the Labor movement, that the union movement was relevant to them. And of course, today there's more women union members than men. And we have 2 women leading the union movement. So there certainly was opposition, but there was also that determination, and I think there was, as you say, John, that sense of inevitability of change. But it didn't just happen. It took a lot of lobbying and advocacy. And women who were in positions of authority within both the movement, both wings of the movement, used that authority to argue the point.
Warwick Smith asked, have major party cultures really changed since the 60s? Or do the apparatchiks across the party hierarchy still resist promoting and supporting effective women leaders? I mean, maybe behind the scenes, you mentioned, for example, that even within the Labor government here in Western Australia, you know, cabinet is not, you know, hasn't got equal numbers. And like I said, we haven't had that. We only had one woman leader of the Labor Party at the federal level. So, I mean, maybe you know, there's the glass ceiling still exists even within the Labor Party.
Oh yeah, and if I share my own experience, when I put my hand up for pre-selection, which was when Jeff Gallop stepped down from the seat of Victoria Park, I'd always said to people, I'm only interested in representing the community where I live, and I'd lived in Vic Park since I moved from Melbourne in the 70s. So I put my hand up. I was the endorsed left candidate because what I haven't touched on in this is the Labor Party is, as everyone I'm sure participating in this Curtin Corner would appreciate, is a factional beast. I was the left's endorsed candidate for that. Because it wasn't you know, a state election, it was Jeff's resignation, and so it was a vacancy. It was a decision by the admin committee as to who the candidate would be. And despite being the left's candidate, I was not supported by one of the major unions on the left, and I didn't get up. And it's an interesting reflection that a number of people have made to me, that of all the secretaries of the missos who put up their hands for pre-selection, Clive Brown, Jim McGinty, and after me, Dave Kelly, were not only pre-selected, but went on to become ministers, very successful ministers in Labor governments. So whether there was a gender dimension to that, about not getting pre-selected, I don't know. But I think, it's an example of there are still, there are still issues. There are still, and while I use the Emily's List slogan, when women support women, women win, clearly not all women support all women. And other things like factional stuff comes into play. But I guess from a broader perspective, you can see the cultural and change that has occurred.
Interesting. When you think about the word power brokers, I mean, my immediate image of a power broker is a man. Sorry, in terms of both major parties, I can't think of too many. People talk about the various factions in the parties. And they can always talk about the Conroy faction or the Shorten faction or the whatever it is. But you don't think of, unless I'm out of touch now, can't think of too many factions or the power brokers who are women. And so it's much more collective effort through, for example, the Emily's List type move.
It is. But if I can just share with you one of the stories that Joan Kerner used to tell, which was when she was Premier, she was always drawn in the papers in Victoria in a polka dot dress. And she challenged the cartoonist and said, "Why do you always draw me in a polka dot dress? I don't own a polka dot dress." And he said, "I don't know how to draw powerful women." And so Joan, of course, used that as a campaigning and advocacy, and we had the Spot on Joan campaign, which tried to challenge that. I had my own experience of that during, as Secretary of the Missos. I mean, I was the secretary of one of the state's largest unions. It was a powerful union, and we had a dispute at Charlie's, I remember at one time, and the cartoon in the West. I mean, at that time, we were sometimes referred to as the Miscellaneous Workers Union because there was myself as secretary. Sharon Jackson was the assistant secretary, and we had a lot of women officials. And we were on a picket line at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital. And so most of the officials were women, most of the members were women, but the cartoon was all male, your classic, union official. So there is still those, and if you look at the cartoons today, you'll see it's almost like the polka dot of Joan's era. All the women that they draw have all got dangly earrings and are all a certain, look a certain way. I think there's still, I would hate anyone to go away from this Curtin Corner thinking that, job done. I guess what I was trying to do was share a story around political, the struggle for political equality in that context of over the years. But
okay, a couple other questions.
A lot to do still.
Right. Janice Dudley, another great friend of Curtin Corner. Hi, Janice. Do you consider the potential appeal of One Nation to Labor voters a threat to the electoral appeal of Labor women and hence Labor? I mean, Michelle Grattan's quote you talked about before. I mean, is One Nation led by a woman a threat to that potentially?
I've not given it any thought in terms of the gender dimension to One Nation. I guess their policies in terms of immigration and other aspects like that are just absolutely overwhelming in terms of any other considerations, in my view, as to the concerns that One Nation, the kind of issues that One Nation are pushing. And I've not looked at it at all from a gender perspective.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, we have to hopefully look at the polling and see whether the gender split support of One Nation is, by having a woman leader, for example, whether it's made any difference to whether, traditionally sort of far right parties tended to be more male supported than women, but whether having a female leader, like for example in France with Le Pen, makes a difference, I'm not sure, but we'll have to go back and have a look at the stats, Janice, or you can tell us what the answer is. Other questions here. Helen Verhoef just sort of said, great to see Emily's List is now supporting more cold, as in culturally and linguistically diverse women, because while companies, for example, are doing better at balance on boards, they are largely replacing John with Jenny, which is probably not a bad point to make. So the diversity agenda is having to be broadened out. And you mentioned that Labor's also done that with, for example, Carol Martin and Aboriginal women being pre-selected now.
Well, yes, Carol was the first, and she's certainly not been the only one. And there's a range of Aboriginal women. There's a range of women from a diversity of cultural backgrounds, both in the federal parliament and in the West Australian parliament. So yes, it's something that Emily's List has been, from the beginning, we had one of the pillars of equity and diversity, but has certainly been very conscious of that.
Dilly also asks about looking at the scrutiny faced by female leaders, maybe particularly in Australia, although I think in New Zealand that also happened a bit with Jacinda Ardern. What lessons are there for better supporting emerging women leaders? Does Emily's List, once someone is pre-selected, that's it's job done, or is there also support for women once they actually are in leadership positions?
Yeah, Emily's List, part of the process, while Emily, as I said, stands for early money is like yeast, and so it was very much around raising money, particularly in the early stages when we didn't have the campaign financing that we do now. But a critical part of Emily's List from the beginning has been mentoring, and that support for women candidates. But that continues on in that it's a network of women, and women do support women, not just in terms of that as candidates, but the mentoring relationship sometimes continues on. I know from my own experience, I still, for women that I had mentored as an Emily's List mentor, continue to have that kind of relationship with them subsequently. So yeah, that support is very much there. I don't know if all the political parties have it, but certainly the Labor Party has a status of Women's Committee, which all the Labor women MPs belong to. And so there's formal mechanisms as well where the women parliamentarians support each other. But there is that sort of broader sense across and, Emily's List is now in its 30th year and continues to have functions and that sort of thing where women can come together and provide that support for their women parliamentarians.
Okay, last couple of ones. Janice, as I thought, as a former political science academic at Murdoch, has come back with some research to say that, re the One Nation question, polling has shown that potential male One Nation voters returned to the Liberal fold almost immediately that Susan Lee was deposed/replaced. So it might say something about the type of support that the Liberal Party and what's happening on the right wing of politics in Australia, potentially. So thanks, Janice, for that. I wasn't aware of the machinations of the voting support blocks over there on the right wing. We'll see what happens in the next couple of years, or even at this next the next by-election in Farrer. So I was just thinking, in terms of where to next. I mean, is the next frontier? I mean, is it mainly those absolute top leadership positions? Is that really where the real challenge now is, or uh, is it other organisations? Where do you think the next challenge from a Labor perspective is, or an Emily's List type of perspective? Because there are other groups. I mean, I think there was an organisation modelled itself on Emily's List in the Liberal Party, and in fact the leader of that, I think, resigned after Susan Lee was deposed. So is there any actual interaction or interchange with those other organisations in those other parties or other organisations that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think for feminists like myself, my energies are directed into issues around working women. And, here in 2026, we have a situation where women at work do not have access to toilet facilities. So the Rail, Tram and Bus Union, for example, is running a campaign about this, of women who are driving trains, who are not able to have access to toilet facilities. Women who are working in road maintenance areas in the country who do not have access to toilet facilities have to go into the bush. Now, where it's basic rights like that, there's still a lot of work for us to do. But I guess where I take, as I said, the fact that change is possible is something that we have seen through these political milestones being achieved. So I guess my focus is more on those kind of areas through the issues that women face, working women face, the issues around poverty in this country, that the impact is more on women, and the impact on children. So they're the kind of areas that I am very much focused on around women's work.
Last one. I mean, the fact that so many of not just the Teals, but also the independents for different, like Indi and other seats like that, have basically almost all been women. I mean, what does that tell us about Australian politics or Australian society, for that matter?
I think while they have pretty much all been women, they've also been credited with running community-based campaigns. And certainly going back to the days when women were elected in the Labor Party in the 80s, many of the women who were elected were seen as coming from the community. So those community links are really, really important. And that's really what members of Parliament are supposed to be doing, representing their communities. So those, women who are independents and have been doing that. But I'm certainly conscious of the comment that Anthony Green made in an election analysis, is that attributing the success of so many of the independent women was that in recent years they've had a financial backing. And I go back to that in terms of certainly Emily's List. It was a recognition, and certainly originally from the US, where we all know elections are really, really expensive and cost a fortune to be a candidate. It was about providing a financial as well as a support network for women. And so that financial aspect is something that we've seen as a factor, I think, in the last couple of elections that perhaps wasn't in place in earlier times.
Emily's list on steroids almost. We're certainly on the financial side of things. Yeah. Well, look, Helen, that's been fascinating and very enlightening, and I'm sure our audience has also enjoyed it. So on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for delving back into the past, but not just the past, also the present and the future, to talk about this really important movement that you helped found back in the day and are still involved in. So thanks very much for your contribution today. It's really great. Thanks.
Thanks, John, and thanks for everyone participating. It's been great.
Yeah, no problem. And just reminding people, there won't be a Curtin Corner next week, but in a fortnight's time, 27th of March, we're going to have a webinar by Dr. Abul Rizvi, who you may have seen on TV. He's a former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration. He's a regular media commentator on population and immigration issues, and he's going to ask, how many Australians should there be? So talking about population and migration issues, it should be a very interesting Curtin Corner. That's in a fortnight's time. Before then, please go onto the website, check out previous talks, and tell all your friends about Helen's talk. They couldn't come today, and her talk will be up on our website soon. So thanks very much to Helen. Thanks very much to all you guys for watching, and we'll see you at a future Curtin Corner. Good night. Have a great weekend. See ya.
Thanks, John.